I believe we are live. Good evening, everyone. My,
Hi.
my name is Katherine. Welcome to Authors Reading Aloud. I'm very honored this evening to be joined by Katherine Anderson, who is here with her novel, Hospital Hill. Katherine Anderson is an award-winning author of two historic mysteries, Hospital Hill, which we'll hear some of tonight, and Shadows in the Ward. Katherine was born in 1980 in Western Massachusetts and is a special education teacher. For many years, Kate has also worked painstakingly researching and documenting the insane asylums and state schools in New England, publishing multiple nonfiction works and lecturing on the history of mental illness. So we're very excited to hear some of her fiction tonight as a treat. Katherine, do you have anything you want to say before we get started this evening?
No, other than thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be able to talk about fiction for a little while. Even though I do get to talk about asylums constantly, it's nice to get to talk about the fiction too.
We are looking forward to this. I'm going to turn things over to you then, and thank you so much.
Okay, I have a slideshow presentation that I'm going to share in the background here. So give me 1 second just to get that going for you. And let me tell you a little bit more about myself and why Hospital Hill. Hospital Hill is a real place. Northampton State Hospital in Northampton was built in 1856, and it was one of the premier asylums in Massachusetts for the over a century that it was open. So it took me about 6 years to write this novel, in between researching and writing my first nonfiction book, and of course exploring and photographing these beautiful abandoned asylums, because of course Northampton was abandoned by the time I saw it. I had already written 2 young adult novels about exploring, but when I came to write Hospital Hill, I decided it was time to kind of try my hand at a cozy mystery. And that's how Hospital Hill was born. The book stars Valerie Martin, who started on the wards of Northampton State Hospital in 1959 and worked there until the deinstitutionalization movement took off, which was the political and bureaucratic movement that closed all the state hospitals in the United States. At that time, Valerie decides to transfer to Westboro State Hospital, which in reality stayed open until 2010. And she retires from there, only to be called back to Northampton State Hospital to do one last task, archiving some patient records. And that is where our story begins. So I'm going to read a little bit from Hospital Hill for you. Chapter 1. Valerie Martin's last day at Westboro State Hospital was uneventful. Everyone in her department knew that she didn't like fanfare. So instead of the usual niceties of cake and a public send-off, someone circulated a card and left it on her desk along with an empty file box. That was on Thursday. On Friday, she purposely chose an early morning train from Worcester in order to avoid the commuters, arriving to find the Springfield station quiet under the dingy yellow of the fluorescent lights over the ticket booths. "Excuse me," she said, reaching out to grab a passing porter, but withdrawing her hand just shy of his sleeve. "Can I still grab a cab from here?" "Yes, ma'am," he nodded, gesturing toward the escalator inside the station. "Take that down to the street. There should be a few waiting." As her cab crested the hill on Route 66, Val caught her first glimpse of Hospital Hill, the loony bin, the bug house, Northampton State Hospital. Though it was nearing dusk and there were no lights left burning on the now abandoned campus, Valerie could envision exactly what waited, crouched in grayscale behind chain-link fences. The buildings that were now being readied for demolition. The buildings that had once been alive, brightly lit, and filled with the hustle of daily routines. The heart of the hill. It had been nearly 15 years since she left Northampton for Westboro, and she wasn't quite certain how she felt about her return. Though on one hand it had been simple to leave Westboro as she wasn't married and had no family to speak of, it had still been an emotionally draining decision. She had been so close to retiring from the Department of Mental Health, but she had had a difficult time saying no, pushing aside that light at the end of the tunnel she'd been dreaming of, a tiny house somewhere at the top of a hill, preferably not around the corner from a hospital. Valerie had spent the bulk of her career at the Northampton State Hospital for the Insane, But in the spring of 1980, after the first major wave of patients had been released from the dying shadow of an asylum, she had seen the proverbial writing on the wall and taken advantage of the department's offer to relocate her. She headed out to Westboro and hadn't looked back until her former colleague Bill Dunstan had called. He had sounded rather reluctant on the phone, but he said the department was desperate. They needed a former NSH staff member to assemble patient reports in the Haskell building, a task that would likely take a few months to complete, and the department had specifically requested Valerie. Though she couldn't necessarily say she was pleased with the idea of coming back to Western Massachusetts, Westboro was now preparing for closure as well. So she agreed to one final, rather menial task, but one she knew she could accomplish with her eyes closed. Chapter 2. It was nearly September of 1959 when Valerie Martin tucked her purse under her arm and walked the short distance up West Hampton Road to Hospital Hill, where the Northampton State Hospital for the Insane perched on top like a beautiful gargoyle. Having graduated from Smith College in May, she had assumed she would find a teaching position in one of the local schools, but by mid-August, nothing had materialized. Though if she was being honest, she hadn't tried very hard to find something. Only now her campus housing allowance was about to dry up, and she knew her parents wouldn't be best pleased to learn of her lack of ambition. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk reading, her roommate, Susan Tellier, suggested she apply at the Asylum on the Hill. They pay $1.50. That's more than any of the shops in town, Susan said as she fluffed her hair and pulled on a lavender cardigan that perfectly matched the tiny flowers on her perfectly pressed dress. I had an interview last week, and they should be calling any day now. As she flounced out of the room, Valerie shrugged and thought, what the hell? A paycheck was a paycheck. The Hill itself was well known in town, not just because of the loony bin, but because it was where almost everyone in town went sledding each winter. She wound her way over the road to the path that led past the doctors' houses and the wrought iron fountain to the famous portico of Old Main, the administration building, where a few cars and ambulances idled outside the doors. Valerie slipped between them through the heavy wooden doors and into the lobby, where a receptionist sat guard at the foot of massive twin staircases that swept up to the floor above. Her heels clicked on the hardwood floor as she approached the woman behind the desk, who was efficiently answering and transferring phone calls. She held up a slim finger topped with a brightly polished red nail, silencing Valerie for the moment. Greeting a caller with, "Hello, Northampton State Hospital, how may I direct your call?" A moment later, the woman motioned for Valerie to step forward. "Can I help you, dear?" "Valerie Martin, I'm here to apply for a position." "Have a seat," she said, looking Valerie up and down. "I'll call Mrs. Harding for you." She gestured toward a wooden bench near the door, and Valerie sat with her ankles crossed, her hands in her lap. She had worn her favorite navy dress with the black buttons, and her shoulder-length blonde hair was pinned away from her face, which was bare of makeup. The pink flush on each of her cheeks highlighted her blue eyes, set deep in her pale Irish face. As she waited, she glanced around the lobby at the elegant staircase, the neatly dressed hospital staff going up and down. After waiting a good 20 minutes, a woman in a smart gray skirt suit with a starched white blouse under her jacket approached Valerie. The woman, who she assumed was Mrs. Harding, had graying mouse-brown hair and black cat's eye glasses that framed her equally mouse-brown eyes. The only makeup she wore was her coral pink lipstick that had spread dangerously outside her lip line. "Young lady, you'd like to apply for a position at our hospital?" "Our hospital?" Valerie stood and offered her hand to the imperious-looking little woman, then withdrew it, as she could see that Mrs. Harding had no intention of shaking it. "Yes, ma'am, Valerie Martin. I just graduated from Smith College." "And what is your degree in? Child care?" "Well, not exactly." Valerie squared her shoulders. "Education, yes, but also English. I write." Mrs. Harding pursed her lips and rolled her eyes ever so slightly. "Come with me. Have you ever been inside an asylum before?" Valerie followed Mrs. Harding across the lobby to the staircase on the left. "No, ma'am, I have not." At the top of the stairs, Mrs. Harding stepped aside to let a grizzled-haired woman in a gray sackcloth dress pass, a female orderly in a crisp white uniform following close behind. Mrs. Harding nodded at the orderly and reached to open a door on the right side of the hall, ushering Valerie into an office that was just as neat and fussy as the woman who occupied it. "Now, at the moment, I am in need of responsible, reliable young ladies to work on the female wing in Ward B. The duties include escorting the patients to and from activities, assisting them with their chores, and keeping them in line on the ward. You will report to the nurses who run the ward and do as they say. Does that sound like the sort of task you can handle with your fancy college degree, Miss Martin?" Valerie snapped her head up, prepared to set Miss Harding straight on her views about educated women, But seeing the challenging look in the woman's eyes, she simply nodded. Yes, ma'am. Indeed. Mrs. Harding pulled open a drawer and handed Valerie an application and a pen. Fill out what you can. The salary is $1.50 per hour. Women don't get raises, so don't even consider it. You start next week on second shift, she said, her lips curling into a sneer. Or will that occupy too much of your dance card? No, ma'am, second shift is fine. Lord, what had she just agreed to? And that's it for Hospital Hill, because if I read more, it'll give it all away.
That's fair enough. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Let's see here.
And I have a little bit more of the slideshow, unless questions are rolling in or comments.
Well, it looks like you have some comments from people who have read the book and said it was a really good read. So you have some fans.
That's what I like to hear.
Anxious to hear your voice. I think you brought up a really interesting point here with the character, and of course she's a fictional character, but I'm feeling all of her pressures about being an educated woman at this time, just trying to get a job. How much did that encompass your research, and how did you kind of come up with this character, and is this a struggle that she continues to face throughout the book?
She does. The entire time, the book flashes back and forth between her time on the wards and her time when she returns. Clearly, when she returns, she's gained some stature in the Department of Mental Health. She's worked for the department for many, many years. But when you rewind to watch how things play out in the 1950s, early 1960s for her, it's not just the struggle of making people understand that educated women were a thing and should be paid well and should be treated well and allowed to do their jobs properly. But you also get to see the dynamic between her and the male staff, because of course at that time, nearly 98.9% of the doctors working in asylums were male. It was very rare to see women on the staff. However, Massachusetts was one of the few states that did have female doctors and pathologists on their staff. But in the case of this book, I chose to keep it status quo, the way most of the asylums operated. And Valerie does have to fight to get respect, and she has to fight to be heard. But even in the end of the book, when she starts revealing that she's finding discrepancies in the patient records, she has to fight to be heard.
Certainly a struggle I think that many can relate to. So if you don't mind, I'm curious, you said that at the beginning that you started working on this novel while you were also doing research for your nonfiction work. Is this a chicken and the egg question, which came first in terms of ideas and inspiration?
The idea for the novel, I think, hit me the minute that I saw Northampton State Hospital. The photograph that's on the screen is actually one of the first that I ever took of the state hospital. I went up on a very gray winter day and started taking some pictures. As you can see, the windows are gone. They were already ready to demolish this part of the building. I knew nothing about it when I first saw it. All I knew was that it was an insane asylum. It was being torn down. I didn't know the history. I knew nothing about the architecture, but something about it just grabbed me. And I've always loved abandoned buildings. I've been writing about abandoned buildings since I was a kid. I think I scared my fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Regish, when I wrote a story about an abandoned nightclub my parents had taken me to. Because it was all true. My parents had taken me to see an abandoned nightclub. They are the reason that I am addicted to abandoned buildings, them and my grandmother. But there was something about Northampton that was different from any other abandoned place I'd ever seen. But true to my nature as a history nerd, I had to learn about it first before the full inspiration for the novel came about. There was something that told me I couldn't write the story until I knew the real human story behind the state hospital. And that kind of is what led to the novel itself.
I can relate to that on so many levels. I work so much with history today professionally, but really my first entry to it was walking into a building, walking into a particular room and just being struck. And there was just something about that space that was going to sit on my imagination, and I didn't know what I was feeling. And so I decided I was going to start reading about it, and
Yep.
years later I'm still reading about it.
Yeah, and you can't stop. I mean, and this was one of the second pictures that I took that day,
Mm,
where you can see the screened in porches, and they're not normal screens like you or I would have on our window to keep bugs out. They're heavy mesh screens to keep people in. And you see
I
things
see.
like that. You see things like that. And I mean, it raises questions for anyone who's not familiar with mental health. I was already working in the field, so I was vaguely familiar with what I was looking at. But I knew I needed to learn more. I also knew I needed to get inside, and so eventually I did. And these are some of the pictures from inside. And I think after seeing the insides of the buildings, not just that there were things left behind like patient beds and things like that, but the fact that as you can see in the picture of the hallway, there was beautiful architecture. There was a lot of time and effort put into these buildings. And I wanted to understand why, because I think our public image of insane asylums and psychiatric facilities is one of the snake pit. We very much have no real conception of life in the asylum prior to the 1950s, when all of these exposés started coming out and we started getting this horror movie image of what the asylum truly was. So it was interesting to me to see this other side of the asylum history, which I tried really hard to bring out in Hospital Hill. I wanted people to see that, Northampton was built to be comfortable, to be beautiful. Beauty and comfort were actually part of the treatment model that Northampton was built on. It didn't become a snake pit right away. There were beautiful transformational things that happened in a lot of the state hospitals.
What is the age of the looking at right now? I mean, that is a beautiful hallway. I can see all the elements that are still there, as aged as they are.
That building has been renovated and is now, I believe it's apartments.
Oh wow.
Yeah, yeah. That was actually one of the nurses' dorms. That was the male nurses' dorm, and it was absolutely beautiful. It was also part of the movie set for the film In Dreams with Robert Downey Jr. and Annette Bening. So there were actually bits and pieces of the movie set left in that building when I photographed it. That photograph is actually only probably about, I want to say, 2 or 3 years old.
Oh wow.
The building aged well, surprisingly. And obviously I have a collection of images, but if anybody wants to see more, there's a wonderful website called Opacity. And he has some beautiful work. I'll track back to that, but Northampton was actually used as the set for 2 movies. In Dreams is less known. It's a little bit of a horror movie, but you get to see a really good view of Northampton State Hospital kind of in one piece before it started to decay and get nasty. And then it was also used in Cider House Rules, but it's not as obvious that it's Northampton because they did build a sound stage, so it looks a little bit different. But it was used in both of those.
Here's a question. Do you know if any new mental health asylums are being built?
The last one that was built in Massachusetts is the Worcester Recovery Center. They tore down the original Worcester State Hospital in order to make room for it. But unfortunately, no. And I say unfortunately because right now, the top institutions that care for our mentally ill are actually prisons. We don't have a solid mental health care system in the United States now that we don't have asylums. We do not have any kind of comprehensive inpatient care, and no plans to rebuild anything on the grand scale of these original asylums, unfortunately.
Yes, an ongoing discussion, I think, as we look forward to how do we appropriately care for people. Prison is not always the most appropriate setting, it would seem.
And the homeless population has also skyrocketed because of the closures. In the first year after Northampton closed in 1991, the police logged over 100 arrests of patients trying to get back into the building because they didn't know how to live in the community. Some of the group homes that they set up in Northampton, one of them burned down. There were patients who died in the care of the group homes because they weren't ready for round-the-clock care of some pretty intensive mental health needs.
Here's another question. When is another book coming out?
So that's the best part about this whole entire thing. So after I finished writing Hospital Hill, I decided I wanted to keep going with the asylum theme. I didn't want to write a series, but I wanted to write books that connected. So for folks, some folks have read it and some haven't. The second book is Shadows in the Ward. Valerie reappears. She's a continuous character, but you can read the books on their own. They do stand alone. So Shadows in the Ward moves to when Valerie is working at Westboro State Hospital in the 90s before she retires. But I have decided that the third novel is going to carry over a different character, and it's going to be set at Worcester State Hospital. So the opening of that novel is in 1991 when there is a massive fire at Worcester State Hospital that destroyed almost the entire asylum. And the story is actually partially that of a friend of mine, Paul Johansson, who was a research assistant there at the time. And instead of evacuating, he grabbed his camera and took some amazing pictures of the fire. And that is what inspired the next book, which is The Burning Season. It still has a little ways to go, but it's coming soon.
Exciting.
Yeah. So now everybody who's read the first two books gets to spend some time guessing at which character carries over into the next book.
Aha, a mystery. Okay.
Yes, I've hidden Easter eggs in all of the books, and some folks who have read the first two books have identified some of them, and there will be some in the third book also.
Okay, we can look forward to those. All right. Everyone really loved that picture of the hallway. That was an amazing photo.
Oh, thank you. That's one of my favorite photos.
All right. Well, it looks like we might be coming to a close here. Kate, do you have anything that you want to say before we wrap things up here?
Just that I hope that anyone who has read the books or plans to read the books, I hope that it sparks in people the desire to learn more and the desire to ask questions. Even though these are novels, I wrote these novels because there are a lot of people that have a hard time approaching the topic of mental health and mental illness through nonfiction. So, but they're willing to read a cozy mystery and then ask questions about the cozy mystery, not realizing how much they're learning about mental health at the same time. There are a number of incredible books out there about Northampton State Hospital, and I have to give a couple of amazing shout outs to some friends. Another friend of mine who wrote, I think we would call this probably science fiction, but it's a phenomenal book, Shadows in the Asylum, which is what Shadows in the Ward is named for. My friend Dave Stern, who created this wonderful book, is kind of like it's a very visual journey through the records of a person committed to Northampton State Hospital. So it's kind of a cool way to look at the hospital itself. And most recently, a friend of mine, Mark Ressler, put out a panoramic tour of Northampton State Hospital. So he documented the hospital for many years while it was approaching demolition. And these are his panoramic images of the hospital, and it's beautiful. And of course, the Images of America book by J. Michael Moore and Anna Juliet Haber. And Anna is an incredible installation artist. If you have read the first two books, you know that Valerie and Harper both attend Habeas Corpus, which was Anna's installation art piece at Northampton State Hospital, where they wired the entire hospital to play Bach's Magnificat. And there is video on YouTube of Habeas Corpus if you ever want to watch it. It's incredibly moving. And I think it was a great way to link the two books together. with that particular event. And this is the poster from Habeas Corpus, which is one of my prized possessions. I love it. And also I have one of the diamond windows. Anyone who has ever read anything about Northampton State Hospital, the architecture was unique in that their isolation rooms had diamond-shaped windows with the metal grates. The regular rooms had diamond-shaped windows with the threaded glass. So this was a gift to me at one of my book signings and also one of my most treasured possessions.
That's amazing.
So again, hopefully, if anything, these books spark the desire to ask questions and learn more. And I always have reading lists available. I have viewing lists available. So anytime anybody wants to turn into an asylum nerd, they know where to find me.
Good to know. And I just want to thank you, Kate, not only for being with us tonight, but just for your work and taking this into the realm of fiction. As you said, it can be hard for people to relate to a nonfiction book, but I think one of the goals in history, for those of us who work with it so closely, we want people to connect with these stories. We want them to know not just what happened, but to be able to connect with a story. And I think that you've done a great job here. Opening this world and inviting new audiences in so that they can learn about the world of the asylum and really contemplate how we handle mental health in our community. How are we supporting people? So thank you so much for your work.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. I think we will wrap things up here. Thank you again so much for spending part of your evening with us. We will be back here on Saturday at 7 o'clock with my friend Richard Smith, who is a historian in Concord, Massachusetts. He will be sharing some readings about Alexander Hamilton from his book there, but he's also going to talk with us about the work of writing history and his various publications that he's accomplished with Applewood Books and their short history series. So join us for that, and we will see you again soon. Good night.
And Richard is amazing. I'm going to give Richard a quick shout out and a plug because he is a fantastic historian. So make sure you go to his event too.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Have a good night.